It was the late 1980s, deep within the fortified walls of a Soviet High Command headquarters somewhere on the outskirts of Moscow, that a smoke-filled briefing room hummed with the quiet confidence of men who had survived decades of war, bureaucracy, and the relentless machinery of the Red Army. Maps of Western Europe covered the walls, red arrows carved deep into paper, pointing decisively toward the Fulda Gap, toward NATO, toward what these generals and colonels considered the inevitable march of Soviet steel. The scent of tobacco smoke mingled with the faint metallic tang of the briefing tables, a constant reminder that the room was alive with human tension, calculation, and the quiet arrogance of experience. On a flickering projector screen, an image appeared, grainy, perhaps copied multiple times from a foreign technical journal, showing schematics of a tank that some whispered was the United States' latest armored program. A gas turbine engine, they noted, designed not for subtlety or simplicity, but for power and endurance. The officers in the room began to chuckle, at first a low, skeptical rumble, and then a growing chorus of laughter that seemed to echo off the cold concrete walls. "They are putting an aircraft engine into a tank," the colonel murmured, a mix of bemusement and professional derision coating his words. He tapped at the schematic with a pointer, highlighting the absurdity of the design in his eyes. A general at the head of the table, his uniform burdened with medals, took a long drag of his cigarette, exhaling a thin blue cloud. "Aircraft engine? What do they plan to do, fly across the Fulda Gap?" he mused, the corners of his mouth curling in derision. Around the room, the laughter grew louder, the air thick with a collective certainty that this American contraption was nothing more than a curiosity, a boondoggle, a foolish attempt at armored warfare that the Soviets had already mastered through decades of brutal efficiency. They had seen every iteration of Western armor, analyzed every NATO tank design, and judged them all inferior to the workhorse of the Red Army, the T-72 and its larger sibling, the T-80. These tanks were masterpieces of simplicity, efficiency, and speed, forged for the brutal realities of mass warfare. The T-72 in particular was a brawler, a tank designed not for elegance but for survival, not for displays but for results. Its automatic loader reduced the crew requirement to 3 men, lightening the vehicle while maintaining a deadly rate of fire, a perfect blend of engineering and pragmatism. It was a weapon designed for the masses, a steel fist meant to overwhelm any opponent through sheer numbers and relentless momentum. And now, before them on the grainy screen, was a machine that seemed to violate every principle they held sacred, a tank built like a bombastic showpiece, heavy, complex, and ostentatiously engineered for reasons they could not comprehend. The room, filled with veterans of armored warfare, saw it as decadent, unnecessary, and doomed to fail. Yet somewhere beneath the laughter, a shadow of curiosity flickered, a small, unspoken question about the capabilities that lay hidden behind the American pride and engineering spectacle. The briefing continued, the analysts recounting the known specifications. Weight far heavier than the T-72, a gas turbine that guzzled fuel in unprecedented quantities, electronics so advanced they seemed brittle, and armor whose true potential remained unseen. The generals nodded and smiled, unconcerned. On paper, they argued, the M1 Abrams, though it did not yet carry that name, was a clumsy, overbuilt instrument of theater, incapable of sustaining itself on the battlefield the way a Soviet tank could. They imagined it bogged down in mud, reliant on supply convoys stretching miles behind it, with its electronics vulnerable to the chaos of real combat. Their doctrine was clear: a tank must be simple, fast, and replaceable. A soldier must be expendable. Mass must triumph over individual brilliance. NATO's tanks, they believed, were flawed by comparison, beautiful perhaps, but fragile, complex, and slow to repair. Against this backdrop, the Soviet confidence was absolute, unshakable, and complete. They discussed deep battle doctrine, the theory honed from years of planning and refined by the ghosts of World War II. A tidal wave of armor, thousands of T-72s and T-80s sweeping through the Fulda Gap, overwhelming any resistance through sheer momentum and relentless efficiency. Speed was their ally, numbers their weapon, simplicity their guarantee of reliability. Each tank could be repaired with a hammer and a wrench. Each crew could operate under conditions that would paralyze more sophisticated vehicles. To the men in the room, this was the language of victory, the unshakable truth of armored warfare. NATO was expected to crumble before this tide, and in their minds, the M1 was merely a curiosity, a paper tiger that would sink in the first muddy field it encountered. Yet somewhere, hidden between the lines of technical analysis, hints of doubt flickered in the margins of their reports. Intelligence reports suggested that this American tank was more advanced than previously assumed, that perhaps it carried technologies and ideas beyond the comprehension of even the most seasoned Soviet analysts. But these suggestions were brushed aside, dismissed as anomalies, rumors, or exaggerations. Confidence, cold and absolute, remained the dominant force in the room. They believed they understood the battlefield, the weaponry, and the philosophies of their opponents. And in that belief, they found comfort, laughter, and a dangerous sense of invulnerability. As the briefing ended, papers were filed, maps were rolled back into storage, and the room emptied slowly, leaving behind the lingering smoke and the faint echo of laughter. The Soviet High Command continued its preparations, massing tanks, drilling crews, and refining the doctrine that had served them for decades. But even as they worked, a quiet tension hovered in the air, imperceptible, unacknowledged, and yet unavoidable. The Americans, somewhere across the Atlantic, were quietly building something the Soviets could not fully see, a machine that would challenge every assumption, every doctrine, every expectation. In their hubris, the Soviet generals had dismissed the unknown, laughed at the foreign, and assumed that simplicity and mass would always triumph over complexity and innovation. They had no way of knowing that, in the deserts of the future battlefield, this laughter would die in their throats, replaced by shock, disbelief, and the harsh lessons of technological mastery they were not yet prepared to understand. The stage was set, the players in position, and the first chapter of a story that would change the face of armored warfare forever had begun, not in the deserts of Iraq, not in the training grounds of America, but in a smoke-filled room in Moscow, where the confidence of men blinded them to the storm that was quietly approaching, a storm that would teach them that arrogance, when matched against innovation, can be the deadliest enemy of all. While the Soviet generals returned to their routines, confident in their predictions and armored supremacy thousands of miles away, the Americans were quietly shaping a machine that would turn those assumptions into a fatal miscalculation. In secret proving grounds and testing ranges, the U.S. Army trained crews with a precision that bordered on obsessive, forging men and machines into a single deadly entity. The M1 Abrams, though unknown in Moscow, was already more than a tank. It was a system of systems, a lethal combination of engineering, technology, and human discipline that Soviet analysts could only glimpse through grainy satellite images and incomplete intelligence reports. The armor alone was a revelation, layered composites of steel and ceramic, seemingly simple to the untrained eye, yet capable of absorbing and dispersing impacts that would have shattered any conventional tank. To the Soviet observer, the machine appeared decadent, cumbersome, and fragile, a rolling fortress that must surely collapse under its own weight or complexity. The intelligence filtered through GRU channels confirmed every bias the Soviet officers held. High fuel consumption, turbine engines that whined through the desert winds, electronics too delicate to survive sustained combat, and a digital fire control system that must be brittle and unreliable. Yet each of these weaknesses was, in reality, a deliberate strength, designed not for spectacle, but for battlefield dominance. While Soviet officers in Moscow imagined breakdowns and failures, the American crews were learning to move, to hunt, and to kill in ways that defied the rigid doctrines of their adversaries. In the shadows of these proving grounds, M1 gunners trained with thermal imaging devices that could pierce darkness, sandstorms, and smoke with equal clarity, spotting engine heat and friction signatures invisible to traditional optics. Commanders practiced independent turret operation, coordinating with gunners in a dance of lethal synchronization, identifying targets while the enemy remained blind to their presence. The Soviets, stuck in the paradigms of active infrared and low-resolution optics, dismissed these innovations as impractical, assuming that complexity would collapse under battlefield conditions. Reports of turbine engines functioning flawlessly in dust-filled deserts, of fire control computers calculating ranges and elevations in milliseconds, were ignored or rationalized away as anomalies, as the work of a nation spending far too much on gadgets that could never truly be tested. The contrast could not have been greater. Soviet doctrine built on mass, speed, and simplicity. American doctrine built on precision, information dominance, and crew survivability. In Moscow, officers debated the logistics of fuel and spare parts, imagining the Abrams stranded in mud, while in Maryland, crews practiced the very tactics that would render those concerns irrelevant, each movement rehearsed, each shot measured, each kill executed with terrifying efficiency. The Americans were not simply building a tank, they were building a predator, one that would hunt with patience, strike with certainty, and vanish before its prey could even react. The reports that finally reached the GRU in the early 1980s, filtered through layers of bureaucracy and interpretation, described a machine that seemed impossibly over-engineered. Yet the analysts could not grasp its true power. To them, the turbine was a liability, the armor a bluff, the electronics brittle glass waiting to shatter in real combat. And yet, unknown to them, every flaw was a carefully calculated solution to problems that Soviet engineers had never even considered. The Americans were answering a question the Soviets had never asked. What happens when speed is paired with precision, when lethality is combined with survivability, when a crew trained to operate as a single organism can strike from a distance that renders mass irrelevant? Each week, new test results reinforced the truth that the Soviets could not see, that complexity was not weakness, and that innovation, not numbers alone, would define the next era of armored warfare. And still, the laughter echoed in Moscow, subtle now, but lingering, a dangerous echo of overconfidence, a confidence that blinded the high command to the unfolding reality. As the years passed, the Americans refined their approach. Turbines were hardened to resist dust and heat, electronics were shielded against shock and vibration, and crews drilled in target-rich environments until their reactions were instinctual, automatic, precise. The thermal imagers, so misunderstood in Moscow, became extensions of human perception, revealing the enemy long before the enemy could react, feeding directly into fire control systems that made first-round hits routine rather than exceptional. The Soviet analysts, meanwhile, continued to interpret what they saw through their own biases. Convinced that a massed column of T-72s, driven by trained conscripts, could overwhelm anything America might produce. They imagined the Abrams immobilized, vulnerable, and outnumbered, blind to the fact that the very elements they mocked were designed to overcome exactly those challenges. The intelligence apparatus of the USSR was thorough but flawed, meticulous but trapped by its own doctrine. The enemy they studied so intently was building a reality that their assumptions could never anticipate. The contrast between the two forces was philosophical as well as practical. Soviet tanks were designed for daylight engagements, for predictable maneuvers, for rapid, overwhelming assaults. U.S. tanks were designed for adaptability, for night fighting, for long-range lethality, and for the survival of their crews above all else. In the minds of Moscow's commanders, any deviation from massed frontal assault was heretical, unnecessary, or decadent. They could not comprehend a strategy that relied on information, coordination, and precision rather than sheer steel. Every GRU report that described the Abrams capabilities was filtered through this lens, interpreted as weakness, mocked, and filed away. They had no way of understanding the revolutionary hunter-killer tactics being trained into American crews, nor the way thermal imagery would turn the battlefield into a hunting ground where numbers could be rendered meaningless. And yet, even in the shadowed corridors of Moscow, some small, unacknowledged fear may have flickered, a question buried deep beneath decades of confidence and doctrine. What if the Americans had created something different? Something the Red Army could not overwhelm with mass alone? But such thoughts were fleeting, quickly dismissed, a threat too abstract to command action. Instead, the generals focused on logistics, on numbers, on the tried-and-true methods that had won them victory before. Little did they know that the most critical battles would not be fought with quantity, but with quality, with vision, with technology they could barely comprehend. By the time the Americans would bring this predator to the desert, the Soviets would have long since convinced themselves that they understood the battlefield, that they knew the weaknesses, that they could anticipate the chaos. Yet every assumption, every prediction, every dismissal was about to be tested, and the consequences of underestimating an invisible enemy would be both immediate and catastrophic. The invisible enemy was not yet in the desert, nor in Iraq, nor in the line of sight of any Soviet commander. It existed in proving grounds, in simulation exercises, in the methodical repetition of tactics that would later translate into battlefield annihilation. It was precise, silent, unyielding, and it was being perfected with every passing day, while the Soviet Empire remained blissfully confident in its doctrine of mass. The hunter was already being trained, the prey had no idea, and the stage for a confrontation that would redefine armored warfare was being set with meticulous care, unseen, unappreciated, and unstoppable. And in Moscow, as officers continued to debate, write reports, and chuckle over perceived American folly, the invisible enemy grew stronger, closer, and more lethal with every turn of the turbine. Every calculation of the fire control computer, and every disciplined repetition of a kill cycle that the Soviets could not yet imagine. The sun rose over the featureless sands of southern Iraq, casting long shadows across a battlefield that would soon become the stage for one of the most decisive demonstrations of modern armored warfare in history. The Iraqi Republican Guard, veterans trained in Soviet doctrine, had positioned themselves in carefully dug-in revetments, their T-72 tanks aligned in precise formations, confident in the superiority of their numbers, confident in the philosophy that had guided the Red Army for decades. They believed in mass, in the inevitability of overwhelming force, in the immutable strength of steel and simplicity. Across the horizon, hidden from their view, the American M1A1 Abrams waited patiently. Crews crouched behind thermal scopes, engines humming softly, disciplined and silent in the early morning haze. The contrast could not have been starker. On one side, a doctrine built on arrogance and repetition. On the other, a system designed to exploit every flaw, to see what could not be seen, to strike from distances where the enemy could not respond. The first moments were deceptively calm. A sandstorm swirled, reducing visibility to almost nothing, and the Iraqi crews adjusted their optics, believing the storm would shield them, believing that the nightmarish reports of the American showpiece were exaggerated. But the Americans did not need daylight, did not need perfect visibility, and did not require luck. Their thermal sights pierced the storm like eyes of a predator, revealing engines glowing with residual heat, revealing tracks, shadows, and forms invisible to the naked eye. The M1 crews had trained for this exact moment, had repeated it countless times in simulators and proving grounds. And now, the hunter had arrived. Without warning, the first shot shattered the illusion of safety. A T-72 tank, its crew confident, its barrel raised in readiness, was reduced to fire and twisted metal in a single precise burst. The laser rangefinder had measured the exact distance, the ballistic computer had calculated elevation and wind, and the depleted uranium round had struck with surgical accuracy, the blast tearing the turret from the hull, sending the crew into chaos before any other tank could react. The sandstorm became a theater of confusion and terror for the Iraqis, while to the Americans it was a controlled hunting ground. Target by target, the Abrams engaged. Each shot a first-round kill, each burst of fire confirming what the Soviet analysts could never have imagined. Complexity was not weakness, precision was lethal, and doctrine based solely on mass was fatally outdated. Iraqi crews fired wildly, attempting to guess at the position of their unseen enemy, but the Abrams were ghosts, moving, firing, and disappearing before the T-72s could align their sights. The battlefield, once a flat expanse of sand, became a canvas of devastation. Tanks that had once been symbols of Soviet confidence vanished in fire and smoke, their crews rendered helpless by technology and training they could not comprehend. Each explosion, each plume of black smoke, was not merely destruction, but a demonstration of a philosophy of warfare that the Soviet Union had failed to anticipate, a philosophy rooted in the integration of crew, machine, and information that made mass irrelevant in the face of mastery. In the control rooms back in Baghdad, commanders attempted to maintain order, issuing commands that arrived too late, relying on outdated doctrine, and clinging to assumptions of superiority that were evaporating in real time. The M1A1s did not advance blindly. They executed a deliberate hunt, stalking the enemy across the desert, exploiting every flaw in positioning, every weakness in line of sight, every mistake born of confidence. The Iraqi tanks were not just destroyed, they were rendered irrelevant. Their philosophy of warfare shattered, their sense of invincibility replaced with panic. Crews abandoned vehicles, commanders shouted into radios that carried no answers, and the illusion of control dissolved under the relentless precision of American firepower. The very tactics that had made the T-72 a legend in Soviet thinking, the low profile, the rapid fire, the simplicity, were nullified by thermal imaging, computerized fire control, and the lethal coordination of highly trained crews. The battlefield was no longer a test of numbers. It was a demonstration of vision, discipline, and technological supremacy. As the minutes ticked by, entire armored battalions were annihilated. 9 M1 Abrams, operating as a cohesive unit, destroyed dozens of T-72 tanks in under half an hour, the kill count rising while the Abrams sustained not a single catastrophic loss. Each vehicle that survived the storm of fire was a testament to the system, to the philosophy, to the rigorous preparation that had begun in proving grounds thousands of miles away. The Iraqi crews, some of the finest trained soldiers in the world, were functionally blind, their tactics rendered obsolete, their confidence replaced by a dawning horror. For the Soviet command watching through intelligence reports and post-action assessments, the reality was unthinkable. The machines they had dismissed as decadent, fragile, and over-engineered had proven unstoppable. The logistical concerns, the perceived brittleness, the turbine engines, the electronics, all had been carefully optimized to survive and dominate. The T-72, the symbol of Soviet mass and doctrine, had no answer to the hunter-killer tactics it faced, no method to counter a system designed not merely to fight, but to annihilate from a distance where retaliation was impossible. The collapse of Soviet assumptions was not immediate, but systematic. The doctrine that had guided decades of planning, deep battle, massed columns, rapid advances, was exposed as insufficient against a philosophy that integrated lethality, survivability, and intelligence. Reports from the desert returned like obituaries. Hundreds of Iraqi tanks destroyed, almost no American losses, a complete inversion of expected outcomes. In Moscow, analysts pored over the figures, trying to reconcile their assumptions with reality, and found no answers that fit their framework. The laughter that had once filled the briefing rooms in 1978 was replaced by silence, dread, and the dawning realization that arrogance, when coupled with outdated doctrine, can lead to catastrophic failure. Every misjudgment, every dismissal of American innovation, every reliance on mass over mastery was laid bare in the searing light of desert explosions. The Red Army's philosophy, once considered invincible, had been rendered obsolete in a single, meticulously executed operation. And yet, in the American view, the battle was not merely about destruction, but about principle. The principle that innovation, training, and integration of technology could overcome numerical superiority, that a single unit, properly trained and equipped, could dominate a force many times its size. The Abrams were not just tanks, they were embodiments of a philosophy, of lessons learned from decades of military evolution, of the relentless pursuit of adaptability and precision. The desert became a proving ground not for brute force, but for intelligence applied at scale, for systems thinking, and for an understanding that the human element, when combined with technology, could transform the outcome of war. As the dust settled, the battlefield quieted, leaving behind a landscape littered with the wreckage of T-72s and the undeniable proof that the Soviet approach, grounded in mass, simplicity, and assumed superiority, was no match for innovation, discipline, and tactical mastery. The survivors, both human and machine, bore witness to a revolution in armored warfare, a transformation that would redefine doctrine, strategy, and the perception of military power. The collapse of Soviet command was not marked by a single moment, but by the accumulation of failed expectations, the destruction of assumptions, and the undeniable reality that what was once considered folly had become lethal certainty. For viewers, the lesson is clear. Arrogance can blind even the most disciplined minds. Doctrine can become a cage, and innovation, relentlessly pursued, meticulously executed, and courageously applied, can shatter even the most formidable empires. The story of the M1 Abrams and the annihilation of the T-72 column is not merely a historical account, it is a reminder of the power of preparation, vision, and adaptation. It is a testament to the truth that in warfare, as in life, assumptions are dangerous, and mastery comes not from mass alone, but from understanding, innovation, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. If you want to see more stories of Cold War secrets, battlefield innovations, and the moments that changed history forever, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Witness the untold truths, understand the strategies, and see how innovation triumphs over arrogance, one battlefield at a time.